supporting EMUNAH, particularly in such difficult times. I want to thank Pearl. I imagine while you're fasting, it can't be easy to give such a beautiful shiur as well. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Steinberg. Professor Steinberg is Professor of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. He founded a program on conflict management and negotiation. He's the president of NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based public affairs institute, who was awarded the Begin Prize in 2013. His research focuses on the changing nature of power in international relations, Israeli politics, and arms control. And we're looking forward to hearing him.
Thank you. I guess I should use this. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me, and if you can't, put up your hands and I'll try to shout. And I'm sorry that there are people behind the pillar. I know that from going to shul sometimes. I don't do shiurim. I'll say a few words before Torah, before Nevi'im, but certainly I'm not qualified to do shiurim. I leave that to the professionals. I do politics. I study politics. And this is certainly a time, any time for Jews is a good time to try to understand politics. And particularly on Tisha B'Av, there's internal politics, Sinat Chinam, there's external politics, Bavel and Rome. And I look at many parts of the Tanakh from a political lens. I can't help it. Sometimes it drives my family crazy, but there's politics everywhere. And the title of what I chose to talk about here is, and I want to say that I'm really impressed. More than an overflowing house, all of you came out on a day that most of us try to stay at home and not do very much. And so I am impressed, and if I cough a little bit and look for the water that's not here, then you'll excuse me. The topic, the headline for my vort or drash or something like that, a little bit of a mini political discussion and explanation, is the Jeremiah Syndrome in Jewish Politics, Reflections on Tisha B'Av. We all in shul that we read Echa, we read the Torah from Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah. There's a lot of musar in that, there's a lot of tochacha, there's a lot of expression of frustration with the sins, the failures of the back in the time of the first bite, of the leadership, the corrupt leadership, failed leadership, and that's in Yirmiyahu, and it's very strong. And then we talk a lot about Sinat Chinam and the various aspects of that in the when we talk about the Choban Bayit Sheni, the destruction of the Second Temple. But Jeremiah, the words that he brings us is so deeply rooted in Jewish learning and understanding and tradition. The prophet, the Navi, that says to the Jewish people, what you're doing is wrong, and you will be punished for it. And that's created, that's what I call the Jeremiah Syndrome. That Jews in every generation, and particularly in our generation, feel an obligation, or even sometimes imagine that God is talking to them as if they were prophets, and telling them, you have to go out to the Jewish people and tell them to repent from their sins. And in many ways, these self-appointed prophets, and particularly in our time, who get a lot of money from frameworks, European governments, Christian organizations that don't really love Israel. On the contrary, that are Christian groups, Presbyterians, Catholics, Protestants in almost every, Presbyterians in the United States, Catholics and Protestants in almost every Western European country. Oops, sorry, I have to turn off my phone here. Provide money, and I'll give you some specifics, to a lot of money, millions of shekels and dollars and pounds and krona, euros, to give these marginal voices, these self-absorbed Jeremiahs, the ability to go around the world and say, I'm a Jew. I'm the modern Jeremiah. Some of them are from Jews, some of them are religious Jews, some of them are completely ignorant Jews who know nothing about Judaism, except they've heard a little bit about Jeremiah. Some are even non-Jews who are go to organizations and become part of organizations and speak for organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace. They're not Jewish, they're not voices, and they certainly don't want peace. I'll give you many other examples of that. This idea that we have some sort of divine charge, obligation to go around the world and attack Israel on moral grounds. That's what Jeremiah did, right? Jeremiah criticized Israel, Jewish leaders, really, the Jewish leaders of Judea, just before the destruction of the temple, and said, you're corrupt. You are violating Jewish ethics and norms. And so taking on almost like a costume and wearing that costume of being Jeremiah's, these individuals and groups have become extremely powerful in the political war against the Jewish people, against Israel today. We all know about something called most of us know something called the BDS movement, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. We know about the discredited Goldstone report, the farce, the travesty, and the tragedy of attacking Israel through language, moral language of human rights and international law. What we've seen in the last month is an even greater explosion of these attacks against Israel, accompanied by these self-proclaimed false messiahs through the language of morality. And again, it's important to recognize that these are fringe people whose only ability to be heard and to have an impact is that they have a lot of money. There's an organization called Human Rights Watch in the United States. I see a lot of people already have heard of the disgrace. I think that's a very good term. I'm going to use that. Disgrace in a moral sense. This is an organization that was founded by good people doing good things. In the 1970s, Robert Bernstein came back from the Soviet Union. At the time, he was the head of a major publisher, Random House, had made agreements to translate and sell books by Solzhenitsyn and others, and he came back and he said, what's going on in the Soviet Union is wrong. I'm going to help speak out against that, against their abuse of human rights. This was in the middle 1970s. He founded what was first called Helsinki Watch, and among the tremendous accomplishments that he and his organization achieved in the first couple of years, first 10, 20 years, was the campaign to free prisoners of Zion, Soviet Jews, and also non-Jews, who were being oppressed and denied human rights by the Soviet regime. And Natan Sharansky credits, as he should publicly, Robert Bernstein and this organization for freeing him. But as often happens, and I should say also, this is a Jewish organization, not because it says Jewish on it. It's founded in New York, and a lot of the funding for it and the support and the directors in the 1970s and early 80s were Jewish, doing good things. And then it became taken over. It was kidnapped. It was captured by the opposite, by people who were fundamentally opposed to the rights of the Jewish people to self-determination, to human rights for anybody Jewish or Israeli. The head of this organization for the last almost 20 years has been a nominal Jew by the name of Ken Roth, who has, I'm tempted to say, a nominal degree, a fictitious degree. He has no Jewish expression whatsoever except his sinat chinam, his completely unjustified hatred of the Jewish people. It's an obsession. He is, many people now use a social media framework called Twitter, 140 characters. He's obsessively attacking Israel on that. Without any justification, he exploits human rights, and he exploits international law. He was behind very much the first Goldstone report, and Judge Richard Goldstone agreed to head this kangaroo court when he was a member of Human Rights Watch's international board and was very much under the influence of Kenneth Roth. And Kenneth Roth manipulated Judge Goldstone. And I'm not saying that Goldstone was not naive, he was. And it took him about 2 years to recognize that his entire report was simply the result of this manipulation, and then he had the courage at least to denounce it and then keep quiet. Kenneth Roth is responsible for so many examples, that's just one of many, of sinat chinam against the Jewish people, and he has no other Jewish identity. He covers himself in the clothing and the words of human rights and morality without any of the substance. There's an example, I think, of the Jeremiah syndrome by someone who has no connection and may not even have ever read a word of Jeremiah, certainly not in Hebrew. The money that he gets, $45 million a year, that's a huge amount of money. All of the Jewish members of this organization that had, the ones who were responsible individuals, who really had a sense of morality and human rights, have left this organization. Robert Bernstein, who founded it, said, he wrote in the New York Times a few years ago saying that Human Rights Watch was founded to defend human rights against the dictatorships of the world, and now it's part of the alliance of dictatorships and has turned Israel into a pariah state. And he left, and most of the Jewish donors and individuals connected who had a real sense of morality also left. Unfortunately, another marginally Jew, this one with a huge amount of money, George Soros, is now funding this propaganda machine, this anti-Israel propaganda machine that's covered in the facade of I'm Jewish, it can't be anti-Semitism. For many years, Kenneth Roth, on his biographical sketch that he put on his website and was advertised by Human Rights and was written into op-ed articles that were published. I remember one of the Los Angeles Times by one of his acolytes, one of his followers, and this is a religious cult, said, well, Kenneth Roth can't be anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. His father left Germany, at times they used the word survivor, which is certainly not inaccurate, it was also a manipulation, left Germany in the early 1930s and suffered from Nazi persecution. That's no excuse. He uses it as a cover. It's okay that I can condemn Israel because my father was a victim of Nazi persecution. That does not make anything that Kenneth Roth says or does moral or accurate. And they finally took it down when we made that point enough times. So it's this phenomenon of Jews become vicious attackers of Israel. We have enough enemies, we don't need any more. But what they do is they provide this shield, this image of we're Jews, we're more moral than all those other Jews in Israel or in New York or in Washington or in London or in Paris, because we don't allow Israel to get away with all these terrible war crimes that they commit. And because we're Jewish, and because we're moral prophets, then we provide the justification for, whether it's Protestant and Catholic groups, like ICO that in Holland that funds one of the other vicious organizations, totally not Jewish, Ali Abu Nima and Electronic Intifada. It's funded by a Dutch government-funded Christian organization supposedly doing humanitarian work. So all of the Jews who provide that coverage for that are part of this war against Israel, very central to this war against Israel. Closer to home we have from Jews, also individuals, very often publicity seekers, people who are convinced that they're moral and nobody else is moral, people who have never been elected by anybody. There's a small group called Breaking the Silence. There's one, there's also a group called 972 and other groups that are funded by American, sometimes European Jews through the New Israel Fund, and also then by European governments and German institutions. It's amazing that they are able, that they get this money to continue what are really modern blood libels. So you have people in Breaking the Silence who go around the world and say, we are moral, we are Jews, we are the prophets of morality, but our country and 8 million Israelis and Jews who live in Israel, they're immoral. No democratic process. They don't do this in Israel and say, and that's I think the key issue, they don't say, you're wrong, you're acting immorally. I wouldn't think that that's appropriate or just or moral if they were to stay in Israel and stand up on a corner like in Hyde Park and shout, repent, you're doing terrible things, I am the 21st century Jeremiah. At least that would be in the framework of the types of fights and debates that Jews have always had within themselves, and we could choose to ignore them. Those who think they're right could support them. They would vote as they wish to vote in elections. But these are people who travel around the world with all the money that they get. They mount art exhibits of Israeli war crimes in Sweden and in Berlin. Can you believe this? Breaking the Silence sets up a war crimes exhibit in Berlin about Israel. And it's funded by German government frameworks. I was in Berlin, I guess, what was it, about a month and a half ago, just before the war. And at least I have to say that a number of German members of parliament and journalists, when this was pointed out to them and the pictures and the activities were shown to them, they understood that this was not something that their money should be paying for. It's a difficult struggle. And there are many others, unfortunately. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, there are probably less than 1,000. There were 7 million Jews live in Israel. We're not talking about a large group of people, but each one is able to get money and get fame and publicity. This phenomenon about the anti-Israel Jew, the Jeremiah that fits in also to Christian views of how Jews should act and behave, been scorned by God, and we should have our own prophets to tell us that. That phenomenon is also so fundamentally opposed to the message of Jeremiah. What's his message? His message is, yes, we've done all these avevot, that the elite is corrupt, the leadership is corrupt. And I have to say, learning the text and going over with Rav Benny Lau and many others, who point out very strongly, Yirmiyahu expresses many times what we would call today his Zionism. He wants tikkun olam we would call it now. He doesn't go out around the world, or he doesn't go to other parts of Middle East and say, attack Israel, they're evil, the way these modern pseudo-Jeremiahs do. He says, we've done things in our society that are wrong. And we have to build the foundation for a return. He was, in his prophecy in Sefer Yirmiyahu, he talks about returning. And one of the most striking incidents is when he buys a plot of land in Anatot from one of his members of his family. You don't buy land as the Churban HaBayit is coming and you see it before you and you know it's going to happen, and plan for after the Churban HaBayit. If you're not committed to the rights of the, even back then, of the Jewish people, we're talking about 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, the Jewish people, to this land, to living in this land, to being a free people in this land, to determining our destiny in this land. So anybody who goes around the world and claims to be, or puts themselves in the clothing and the language of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, is completely violating the basic principles that we see in the activities and the political framework. And I mean this political and religious, they often very much go together. In his tochacha, in his moral preaching to the royal family, the kahuna, the priests at the end of Bayit Rishon, of the first temple, he's not saying we have sinned, we must be destroyed, somebody else must take over our land, somebody else must tell us what to do. The Americans should tell us that we shouldn't be doing these terrible things to the innocent people in Hamas-controlled Gaza. We hear that far too often in the last couple of weeks. With, unfortunately, this Jewish shield that comes in with it. This is our land, this is our right, this is our homeland. It is for us to determine our future for good or for bad, and I believe in that future. That's the bottom line message of Yirmiyahu. And it's not in any of the different forms that we hear it from 21st century Jeremiahs, most of whom articulate this, at least in English, if not in other foreign languages, as I said, outside of Israel. What do we do about this? How do we deal with this? I'm moving more towards the politics, the more Inyanei Deyoma politics. First of all, I have to say I don't claim it's going to be easy. I've been doing it, I've been fighting this for naming and shaming for the last 13, 14 years, since the Durban conference of 2001, when there were 5,000 people, 1,500 NGOs that agreed on one thing in South Africa, that Israel's an apartheid state, that Israel's a country of war criminals, and Israel must be, they said, the incomplete international isolation of Israel, which is a euphemism for let's wipe Israel off the map. And since then to now, this political warfare has accompanied Israel, always with a strong Jewish shield, at least in name. I don't think the way to do this is by having the Knesset pass laws, because all those, in most cases, those laws don't, and again, we're dealing with the 21st century's political environment, will not solve the problem. They're the wrong medicine for the disease. And in many ways, it even enhances the Jeremiah, self-made Jeremiah image. I'm being persecuted for my ideas, for my moral messaging. Sometimes people confuse Jeremiah with Jesus, and that's another problem. But this idea that we're being persecuted, that we're being singled out, that we're being denied free speech, is not a viable, successful strategy. It's easier for me to start off with what doesn't work, because then it'll make more sense to explain what I think does work. What the late Prime Minister Rabin calls Vang Gamalno, we do one thing and then if the problem to solve doesn't happen, it's not happening in Gaza, we have to be patient, as difficult as it is. And it's not going to happen with this part of the political war, the Jewish pseudo-Jeremiah part of the political war. So these kinds of attempts in the Knesset to outlaw either the organizations or taking the money tend to be counterproductive. There were various attempts to say any organization that has anti-Israel strategies and contributes to the political war against Israel should not be allowed to get money from European institutions, from foreign governments, or from any source outside of Israel. How do you measure that? All these groups will say, we're doing this for Israel's own good, and then it becomes an issue of somebody, it's he said, she said, or it becomes subjective, somebody's opinion, and that's not good law in any society. So I think that has proven itself to be not a very good way to do this. In my view, the most appropriate, most successful approach is to use the same weapons that they use. The language of morality, the language of international law, the language of ethical behavior, the language and the substance of Jewish tradition. The term naming and shaming is extremely important for what are philosophical, ideological, principled conflicts. What they're doing is wrong. And the more people stand up to this, and it's a form of bullying, and say what you're doing is wrong. It's immoral. It's unethical. When you have organizations, I talked about Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International has more money, less Jews. There are very few Jews, and I have to say, lahavdil. The Amnesty USA is one of is probably the major single component in all of Amnesty's framework. And Amnesty was founded in different contexts earlier than Human Rights Watch, without the Jewish framework, based in London, but did similar good things for a few years, and has now also been taken over by people who only manipulate and exploit the language of human rights and international law. Organizations like this, particularly Jewish ones, that cover themselves in the language and the symbols of ethics and morality, need to be confronted with the same language and symbols. And I think it shows that it works. When Robert Bernstein, the founder of Human Rights Watch, wrote in the New York Times that Human Rights Watch had lost its moral compass, that reverberated. A lot of other people left. Yes, George Soros provided the same money, but they lost their halo. Almost everybody who deals with Human Rights Watch in the Middle East knows that they're a propaganda organization. And the more that this is shown and demonstrated, the more they, Ken Roth and others, some are Jewish, some are not, the more that they get angry. And when they get angry, they say even more unethical, and they do more unethical and more immoral activities. Right, just 1 second, I'm just going to have to tell people I can't. I said I would leave my phone on for emergencies. If it's not an emergency, I'm not leaving the phone on. When somebody edits this for posting, you can take that off the film. Okay, thank you. Now we're quiet for 2 minutes. The immorality, as it's being pointed out, Human Rights Watch had a delegation during what we called CAS-led Goldstone time, early 2009. I mean, this just shows you how intensely Kenneth Roth's organization went to attack Israel. It's more like Bilam. It's more like the story of Bilam. And if people who are watching this on the internet, go look it up. It's libel, it's slander against the entire Jewish people. It's hate speech. He went to Saudi, they went, not he individually, because he's Jewish, he couldn't be allowed in. So he sent a delegation to Saudi Arabia to raise money in Saudi Arabia for human rights. Not so that women could drive, Not so that minorities would stop being oppressed. You know the answer to this. They asked for money in order to promote the war crimes trials against Israelis. Is there anything more immoral than that? Yes. Human Rights Watch went to Libya under Gaddafi and crowned him and his family human rights reformers. And then the London School of Economics said, well, Human Rights Watch says that they're the human rights reformers will give Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, a PhD and establish a program. 30-something million pounds. And it was huge embarrassment. That's naming and shaming. The London School of Economics, I don't know if they gave the money back. They should give it to any Libyans who managed to survive in that environment. But the immorality of Human Rights Watch became focused by these incidents and widely known. Yes, there's still some journalists, even the New York Times correspondents, on occasion quote Human Rights Watch, and we have to remind them this is an organization that simply exploits the moral language without any substance. It contributes to the destruction of human rights, but it has really hurt them, their reputation, and left them dependent only on George Soros, or the whole place would have to pack up and go home, which it really should do. So we have to do this a lot more widely. I started to talk about Amnesty International. I'm not reading from those at this point. Amnesty International's, I think, about a third of their total income. It's a big organization with a couple $100 million. Not quite clear now because they're in a lot of trouble. One of the reasons is they lost a huge number of members in the United States. And a human rights professional, lawyer, professor, worked in the U.S. State Department on human rights. A woman by the name of Suzanne Nossel agreed to head Amnesty USA to try to restore its reputation. But she wasn't anti-Israel enough. She was Jewish. And she didn't attack Israel with the intensity that the Kenneth Roths and the parallel Israel haters in the human rights world thought was necessary, and she resigned. She did the right thing. So it's not, she understood that being part of this was evil, was immoral, was completely contradictory to the principles that these organizations claim to stand for. Amnesty International is in a major crisis because they have very little left of Amnesty USA, among other places, and because they're corrupt. You don't hear any of these people saying, well, you've been giving out this money and all these severance packages to some of your leaders. It was done, the investigation was in-house. It was done quietly. But what you see is that these organizations have become, they're the enemy. They're the corrupt groups. And we need to say to them, this is where the corruption is. This is where the immorality is. This is where the unethical behavior is. We, meaning not just Israelis and not just Jews, but anybody who's seriously concerned about human rights. And it is a Jewish cause. It is something that's important. Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948 after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. When righteous Jews survived and Gentiles, Eleanor Roosevelt and others, said we have to have a set of code of conduct. We can't allow the world to continue to do what it did in Nazi Germany, which is, it's another country, it's not our problem, and allow what turned into the Holocaust. Those principles have been hijacked, and we need to reclaim those principles. Those principles have been hijacked to be used as a major political weapon against the Jewish people. And we have to turn that around. So naming and shaming is extremely important in this process. It's not something that has to be, that can be left to a few individuals. I'll preempt, in a few minutes I'll turn to questions. Not speeches, but questions, and I'll try to answer them. But I'm always asked, usually the first question is, I'll ask the first question. Why doesn't the Israeli government do more? I assume somebody here is going to ask me that. Naming and shaming should be done by individuals, by what's called civil society. It should be done by everybody. And I think we've changed, we've seen some changes. It's going to be much harder if we continue to understand this deadly type of warfare the way it's been understood more clearly than ever in the last month. I read at the very beginning, actually, after the 3 boys were murdered, and maybe the very beginning of the, what do we call this? This is
protective edge. Protective edge.
Protective edge. Yeah, the English never works right, but it's an Israeli term. I read an article written by a rabbi from Berkeley, California. Now, I grew up in San Francisco area, still have a little bit of an American accent maybe, and I was an undergraduate in Berkeley, and I ran away to Israel many years ago, where Jews could actually live as Jews. Even then, in the late 1960s, after the 67 war, not much has changed. Israel was guilty of all these terrible things, and Palestinians were only Arabs. Nobody called them Palestinians. Were only victims. And even then, you had Jews who thought they were Jeremiah's, Yirmiyahu's. But there's a rabbi there now by the name of Nachum Creditor who is involved in a lot of organizations that one would certainly have to say is on the left of the political, is critical of Israel. I think that's the term that should be used. And he wrote a piece that was entitled, I'm tired of apologizing for Israel. We say in English, the penny dropped, or the asimon dropped. Israel isn't guilty of all these terrible things of occupation and stealing Palestinian land. Israel's responding to the continuing attempt to wipe us off the map. Now, there are others, but that particular article by an influential rabbi who recognized that this ethical, moral exploitation against the Jewish people has to stop. And he's written many things since then, some 140 characters on Twitter and some longer. There are others, I don't remember right now offhand other names. Well, I think even in Haaretz, no, not too many frowns here. Yes, Haaretz is very much part of this process, and I should have said that earlier. Some parts of Haaretz are really fundamentally immoral, of Guido Levi, Avera Haas, and others. But I think that the owner, Amos Shokin, also thinks he's a form of modern Jeremiah in some ways. But there are articles in there, you have to look for them carefully. Daniel Abraham, who has been a funder, a major American funder, a lot of these organizations that are going from being critical of Israel to being part of this pseudo-Jeremiah process, basically wrote the same thing. And that's an important change. I haven't seen George Soros do that, and he probably won't. But I think this is an important aspect. We need to highlight that. We need to embrace people. Look, Judge Goldstone, and I give him his due credit. He was a judge in South Africa. He's a well-known international legal expert, teaches in major universities. He did some tshuva. Again, he should have done it earlier. He should never have taken the job. Yes, the damage is done. But compared to the others, he's a very important example of someone who recognized that he was part of this immoral war that uses the language of morality and ethics, the language of the prophets, Jeremiah, for immoral activities. And I think we need to find more people like that. When Robert Bernstein said, this organization that I founded has lost its moral foundation, its moral compass, is now doing the opposite of what we thought it was supposed to be doing, he did the right thing. It's a difficult process. Not many people are willing to do that kind of tshuva, are willing to open up their eyes. First it has to be internal, and then it needs to be public, and say, blame it on others. I was duped. I thought that this was going on, and I thought that I thought that all these things that I was told by Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and the United Nations Human Rights Council and all these other, I was going to say perverted, I'm looking for another term, but that may be the term that's going to be left here. Organizations that exploit human rights. And now I've seen that that's not right. That's part of the naming and shaming process. And I think that Judge Goldstone should be welcomed back because he had the, just a second here, that's my son, I'm going to tell him, that I will finish in 15 minutes and pick him up. 20 minutes. Still doesn't hear. It's tough in these days. It's in all sorts of ways. The ability, you have to have the faith and the ability. I don't think it's useful, not just as I don't think it's useful to try to prevent this kind, to be seen as trying to prevent free speech and honest criticism. It actually gives these pseudo-Jeremiahs more claim that they really are prophets. They get arrested just like whatever. They get threatened, harassed, silenced. These are usually the silencers who then complain about being silenced. But it's amazing how people like Ken Roth, who spend their entire lives attacking and criticizing, if they're criticized, all of a sudden, wow, what happened? This is unfair. It's not right. He wrote something that it was childish to criticize him. They don't know how to deal with that. People who do the right thing should be welcomed back. People who do the wrong thing need to be continuously isolated. Not attacked on a personal basis, but for what they do. To be given the opportunity to do tshuva, to be told what you're doing is wrong, but you have the opportunity to at least correct some of the damage, and at least leave your legacy as one where you've recognized the difference between right and wrong, between morality and immorality, between Israel defending itself against tunnel terrorists, and what is it now, up to 3,500 rockets and missiles, including the 8 o'clock boom that most of us heard when they were trying to hit Jerusalem again. I don't know who heard it. I certainly heard it. So, I think we need to be politically intelligent about how we do this. And we need to be consistent about it and work intensely to do it. It needs to be done by, as I said, by everybody. And on this, I'll end and take questions and answers. I'll take questions and try to give answers. We need to be intelligent, we need to be moral, we need to be democratic, we need to be ethical. Precisely to highlight the anti-democratic, immoral and unethical behavior of these campaigns. We need to be intelligent about how we do this. Identify the source, the places where this naming and shaming process can be successful. And to restore the reality of the Jeremiahs, of the image of Yirmiyahu of Jeremiah. First, a Zionist. First, someone who cares deeply about this land, about the tradition, about our rights as a people. And when he criticizes it, he does it out of love and respect and pain. The joy that Human Rights Watch, this pseudo-Jewish organization that called itself Jewish Voices for Peace, got $1 million. Nobody knows where it's from. Probably not from any legitimate donor, because otherwise that would be reported and we would know. Or from groups like, Israeli groups like Breaking the Silence or Zochrot or the other anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-peace organizations around the world. Actually, stop the stream, So I think that we can point to enough successes to show that the system works, and we need to expand it greatly. We're certainly going to be busy doing that so that when the United Nations comes out with what's called Goldstone 2, they'll be laughed off of every platform except ones that are run by the great moral powers of the world: Iran, Syria, Libya, all of those, North Korea. Maybe even the Europeans will recover some of their ethical and moral backbone. I don't know if they ever had it. That's a side comment. I'll just point out Europe. European Union, 28 countries, issued a statement. A few hours, this was on that terrible Friday that there was Shabbat, when there was this pseudo ceasefire. I use that term a lot, pseudo, because it created this facade. It was going to be a ceasefire, and 3 Israeli boys were killed. One was initially hijacked, kidnapped. His body is still being held by these what are called body snatchers in Gaza. These are the people that can, rather than others, defend his moral. And the European Union issued a statement. It was about 3 lines long. It regretted the end of the ceasefire and called on both parties to end the conflict. Not a word about Hadar Goldin, about the other boys that have been killed. That's basic immorality. That's basically wrong. And that's the fight that we have to enter into full strength to recover the moral principles that the Jewish people have always embraced. I thank you. You're a very quiet audience, maybe sticky. And I see already 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. We'll do those 4. You're 5. Okay, start off over here.
I would like to know how we could get our Knesset to get rid of the traitors that are in it. That's my question to you, and I just want to make one comment. I think if we took back the name Palestinian, which was ours originally, since everybody loves them, everybody would love us.
Hey. Look, A, those are issues I don't deal with. B, I think I'm just going to suggest let's choose our language carefully and our tactics and strategy carefully. When you have people whose entire goal in life is to be provocative so that they get talked about and get support from other people who are provocative, the last thing you want to do is give them a platform. So I think our Knesset and our members of Knesset need to learn to be more intelligent in their strategies. And I think we should admire the way the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, and some other people both, and also give credit to the head of the opposition, Bougie Herzog, and others for also acting responsibly and morally in this conflict. So let's be careful. This is not a good day to talk about those types of attacks. I think we can be much more intelligent about it. So I said, who's number 2 here? No, I think you were the red shirt. No, the red shirt. Sorry, the long-haired red shirt. You're number 5. I saw your hand.
I've been corresponding with a Facebook friend who's enlisted my help in combating anti-Israel propaganda. Her husband is also a member of the provincial parliament, so it's important, they're influential people. Can you recommend some websites that I can go to get information? She also sent me articles by Henry Sigmund and Gideon Levy. So we're dealing with really hardcore anti-Zionism. And can you recommend some?
Well, first of all, I will start with my own websites. There he is. If you look me up, I have geraldsteinberg.com, ngo-monitor.org. We have just about everything that I said has been documented in a lot of detail. There are many good places to do that, to find this material. I really can't give you anything more specific than that. There's tons of stuff out there, and I think that a lot of stuff, not everything, but a lot of stuff that's in the Times of Israel is very good. Yes. Alan Dershowitz clearly was very good. in some ways we're blessed, in some ways we're cursed with overabundance of good material that's out there. And again, that's part of what's happened now, is that, and I thought this was going to happen, and it did happen. In 2000, what were they called it, the second intifada, when we were all being killed and being accused of war crimes and massacres, and the Durban Conference and all these bogus Human Rights Watch and Amnesty reports on war crimes. This led to some very, very good people who said, I've got to do this. You have on campuses now students, tremendous, really good, bright Jews and some Christians who have really understood that this is a very important political war. So offhand, I can tell you honest reporting and camera and memory and all these other things.
There's so much stuff out there.
There's so much stuff. Just find what you need and run with it. If you find something good and you want to use it for quotes, run with it and then send it out. I think it's important that we address audiences outside of our own circles. It's exactly it. It's the members of parliaments and the journalists and the educators and of all those areas and diplomats. That's where we have to push through to. So I think we got the right to start. Who was number 3 when I went around the first round? Who was 3? I went 1, 2, 3, 4. Somebody in the middle.
You're right.
So, were you number 3? Okay. Anyway, I'll try to get there, but I'll try to make the question shorter, the answer shorter.
You mentioned the local organizations breaking silence. What about Amnesty International in Tel Aviv? They do great damage. There are Jews who work for them. They have courses on teaching people how to organize and demonstrate against Israel. And it just seems illogical to have them in the country.
Yeah, I really want to caution against using terms like having them in the country. We live in an era of democracy and free speech, and just as we don't accept a situation where the left wing, when Peace Now and other groups say that someone who is not part of their little circle, in this case I'm talking about Einat Wolf, is uninvited from their conference. It's trying to silence even immoral voices through the use of police powers is not something you do in the 21st century. It's just not possible to do. It's not the right thing to do. Naming and shaming is what works. I've always wondered what happens if you have 200 people with signs outside Amnesty's Tel Aviv branch saying, stop your immoral behavior. I think that would have an impact. A couple of newspaper articles about it would have an impact. There are lots of other ways to name and shame, and we need to do that. And the United States government has given money to Amnesty International in Tel Aviv on the issue of the treatment of migrants to Israel. It's not the issue of immoral attacks against Israel. But I've said to the U.S. Embassy, to Ambassador and others, that the organization Amnesty is so anti-Israel that even if it's for a project which falls within the moral and ethical framework, they shouldn't be given a penny. And that's being taken under advisement, but I think we need to do that in a much wider way. I think everybody here who has contacts in wherever countries you might have come from, and there might be citizens of, make that point, because almost every Western country gives money to these groups. So again, the process has to be more sophisticated, more effective, and stay within that moral, ethical framework to work. Over here.
How much influence do we have if we write a letter to somebody who wrote
I'll repeat the question.
if somebody wrote a letter to to one of these newspapers, there was something that came out, how influential do we have when we vote in one of these surveys or polls? It says vote yes, if you're a pro-Israel or something like that. This is something that we people can do, but...
How much influence, the question was, do individuals have when they write letters in response or protest or participate in surveys where you get a request, vote yes for Israel, vote no, whatever. First of all, I'll start by saying some response is always better than nothing. One of the reasons that we have been losing this propaganda war is that between 1967 or 73, or maybe 1993, when Yossi Beilin said we don't have to do, We don't have to fight the propaganda war because the conflict is over. We were completely out of we weren't on the playing field. And so all this pro-Arab, anti-Israel propaganda had a free field. All this what's called revisionist history. And the basic thing that Palestinians and Arabs are always victims, and Israel is always responsible for their suffering. Nobody opposed it. Nobody put the truth out there. I think we've recovered some of that since then. So I think, yes, any letter, any response to a poll, it doesn't take much time, is worth doing. It's not the most effective way to do things. The most effective thing is to be proactive. To take as you see something that happens, you read a newspaper, you get an email, you see it in television, whatever it is, and you see that the US government, the European Union, the British, the French, the Germans, anybody is participating in this activity, and you send them a letter. In many cases, I realize that it's not the same, but I get personal letters back which actually demonstrate how little these people know. And when you engage in it with ambassadors from European countries or with journalists, and they are willing enough to open the door to try to defend their policies, you've got a process going. So I think that the more proactive activities that you can do when you see something. I am so-and-so, I was actually born in the Netherlands or someplace else, and I'm a citizen, and what I find is your activities are immoral for supporting, giving money to breaking the silence. It won't have an impact, and especially if a lot of people do that. You can work with lots of these organizations that ask for people to support this. So it's not so much responding as it is pushing this agenda, because we have to change the way in which this war is being fought, and we can't do that by being defensive.
Why do you think...
Back there.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, you're first and then...
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said that very often we find an organization has been hijacked. So hijacked is like something that happens all of a sudden. And my assumption is that when organizations change from being something advocating human rights to something that really is basically immoral, it's a process. How do we identify that this process is taking place so that we can name and shame much earlier, before things really turn so bad?
I think we are already past that stage. We know. I mean, that's one of the reasons I created this organization and got some excellent people to work with me. That NGO monitors, nobody's looking at this stuff. Let's make sure we have an early warning system. And it doesn't happen, not just what we do, but now, because so many people now understand this. When the US government gives money to an NGO, we input, we tell them. And very often we're certainly listened to in Congress. It's happening now in the European countries as well. There's been enough naming and shaming in a few countries to take this further. Yes, you're right, hijacking took place over a long time because people were asleep at the wheel. But that's over. Nobody here, nobody in Israel that has any awareness of what's going on around them and has some Zionist principles, including Zionist left. And that's the point that I tried to make. The responsible members of the Zionist left, unfortunately not yet the leaders of the New Israel Fund, but many others, and I think the New Israel Fund and other groups will be in a crisis very soon. Their money will dry up because the people who supported them in the Zionist left say this group is really doing immoral activity. So I think we've passed that stage. Just to say, there was a 10-year period where nobody was really paying attention, and there was a morphing. There was a slow hijacking, even by some of the hijackers who didn't know that they were actually doing this. They went further and further towards the fringe, extremist end of the political spectrum, because they thought they were Jeremiahs. So I don't think that's what's going to happen anymore, but we do have to be vigilant.
Okay.
I got this and then one other person after this, and then you guys have all been...
Why does the government sit on the levy report when all...
I'm not doing the levy report, that's not my thing. Not my thing, you get other people to talk to you about that. I focus on the moral, ethical aspects and the hijacking of those principles. So I think maybe that's a good point for me to end. One more question.
NGO stands for peace.
Sorry? NGO, sorry, non-governmental organizations. NGO, it's the language of the United Nations. You're moral, you can come to the Human Rights Council and speak about the
about the violations of human rights, as long as you attack Israel, but don't attack Saudi Arabia or China or Russia.
My question concerns history versus narrative. When we have documents and videotapes and movies of what happened after the Six-Day War, Golda Meir's speech before the UN, the 3 no's, the whole history of this conflict, and then they come up with, well, this is our narrative. Like you can make up a little story.
Since we've run out of time, I'm just going to say to you, it is what it is. You're right. This is the reality. Unfortunately, complaining about it isn't going to help us. We have to have a strategy to fight back against that. And again, it's happening. I mentioned so many different organizations, and I think there will be more and more unity between us. That's part of what memory does. That's part of what other organizations do, is to bring back the history. But if we lost it for 20 years, don't expect to get it back overnight. It's a 20-year fight. It's a generational fight. And it's your children and grandchildren that have to lead that fight, and it's happening. And I have to say, the number of people, I'm now old, the young people who are in their 20s and 30s, who come to my office and send me things, who get it and know this is part of their life's obligation. For those of us who grew up in the 67 period, or those who grew up in the 48 period like my parents, that's what our generation, that generation has to do. It's not enough to go get a good job and work as a stockbroker or a lawyer and make good money. You've got to be involved in the fight for the future of the Jewish people and against this immoral and unethical behavior, which has become the norm. So there's enough work for all of us. Thank you all very much. So proud. NGO mantra.
Thank you very much, Professor Steinberg. I can see we can carry on for a long time, and I really, really, really appreciate you giving us those words. Thank you very much.